welcome back to After the Shot. Again, it's the show where I have taken a picture and I come back and I show you how I edited it. So this one in particular is actually a little bit older. It's an old shot from about 2009 or so. So where it was taken, and I'll show it up here on the screen, a little bit dark, and we're going to make it better so you can see it better. This was taken at Craters of the Moon National Monument in Idaho on top of a volcano with a thunderstorm off in the distance. So it's some pretty cool effects, but it's going to need a little bit of work there. But let's go ahead and get started here on this image. So right now it is way too dark. You can see here that we've exposed for the clouds. The clouds aren't too bright or blown out. They're right where they should be. But as a consequence, and because we didn't put any filters on the camera, on the lens, to make part of the scene brighter or darker, it's too dark. So we could do this a couple of ways. I could do this and just say, let's go ahead and make the whole thing brighter, which will blow out the clouds, and then we could probably go in here and make this darker and make it a little bit better. But I don't think I want to do that today. I actually have a different plan. So if you've seen my videos before, one thing I like to do are make local adjustments. It's basically a little brush right here I'm going to draw on the screen, and I can make it brighter, more contrasty, more saturated, what have you. So first thing I want to do is make this a little bit lighter, a little bit more of an exposure, so we can see the detail inside those shrubs and stuff down there at the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it up. Ooh, I think it's going to require a little bit. Let's start a little over 1.5 stops. And let me check my brush there. We have a little bit of a feather, which actually, if you saw my video last week, the feather makes the brush a little bit softer, a little bit less harsh along the edges. So I think that's what I want to do. And I'm going to draw right along here. And the trick is here, I don't want to necessarily include too much of the sky up here, because if I do, it's going to look weird. It's going to be a weird transition. So this is going to require a little bit of finessing here. And I'm kind of liking where we're going. And I want to see about getting more of that edge near the top a little bit more. So this is going to be the trick, and it's going to require a little bit of finessing, a little bit of maybe some deletion of the brush, because if I don't do it right, it's going to look weird. So we're going to zoom into 100% here, and I'm going to come up here and just gradually fill this in. Okay, it's okay if we have a little bit still there that's a little bit dark. It's never going to be quite perfect. And one thing too, people used to do this in the darkroom. I know I mentioned this last week. They actually used to manually brighten certain parts of their image. So this, and it was not particularly precise back then. So it's okay. So let's not worry about it too much for now. And you could spend maybe an hour doing this, but obviously we only have a certain amount of time in the video. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time. Let's see here. And I'm going to get a little bit more. And for our purposes today, I'm going to say that's about where I want it. Okay, so there we go. And I think I even want to make it a little bit lighter. So let's go ahead and bring this up. About like so. And I am starting to like that quite a bit. So let's kind of look at the entire image and let's try to make some adjustments to it. So I want a little bit more color in this image as well, because you can see in the shrubbery, the greens, if you look down here, the kind of this red-orange dirt or parts of the volcano, it's a little bit dull. So I want to go ahead and make that a little bit more colorful. I like to use vibrance. I find that the vibrance slider down here is a little bit more realistic than using saturation, because for example, I do saturation and quickly it starts getting unrealistic. In fact, I'll slide it all the way up there so you can really see what we could do as far as this effect. I'm not a big fan of that. I'm going to switch that back to 0. And if you look at vibrance here, it's definitely a more subtle effect, definitely a more realistic effect. This is a kind of a new feature of this particular editor we're using. It's Adobe Camera Raw inside Adobe Photoshop. And that vibrant slider has been around for quite some time, and I find it to be pretty effective. And one other thing I want to do is I want to make the image warmer. This is called white balance. So basically you'll see a number up here. This is color temperature. And basically the lower the number, the cooler, the more blue it is. The higher the number, the more warm it is. You can see right there if I went crazy or if I went to the other extreme, you know, it gets all blue. So let me change it back to as shots so we don't lose too much here. And I'm going to add a little bit in there. Let's not do too much, but I like that there. One thing I want to do as well, I'm starting to like this image, but remember I told you there's kind of a thunderstorm in the background, and I kind of want to emphasize that a little bit more, and I'm going to do that a little bit via some color. So I'm going to go in here, and what I can do, I can manually add or subtract a whole wide variety of colors from this image. So I'm going to go ahead and say I want more blue. And you see, the minute I do that, if I make it really crazy, it's going to be a ton of blue. But I think I'm going to do it about right there, because I kind of like, ooh, maybe not quite that much, something about like that. I'm just trying to fool around with this aqua slider as well. Not doing a whole lot. I didn't think it would. There's not too much. I'll reset that back to 0. There we go. And I also think up here at the top, I want to make these clouds a little bit more prominent because they're kind of disappearing. So I'm going to do a new adjustment brush. Just like we did at the bottom, I'm going to try and do it here at the top as well. I'm going to keep the same settings for now, which may be a little bit too much, but let's see. So I'm going to come up here and we're going to draw. And as you can see, that is probably a bit too much. As you can see down here, I kind of overshot these clouds, and now I've got a little bit of kind of some overhang here that I don't really want. So I'm going to go ahead and hit my, there's an erase button up here. Go ahead and hit that. And I'm just going to steadily but carefully slide that brush up there. Okay. And I think 2 stops, which is quite a bit of extra light, is just way too much for this image. So I'm going to do that. I'm also going to add some clarity. This is a little bit different than contrast. It kind of, I don't know the exact science, but it makes the edges just a little bit sharper, a little bit more prominent. So when I do that, it kind of adds a little bit of mood to the image, which I kind of like. Okay. Now, one thing I'll tell you, I told you I took this about 10 years ago, and this particular camera has quite a bit of what's called noise. It's not one of the newer cameras that's really clean images. As you start making some of these adjustments and bringing up the dark areas, you get some noise. And luckily, this is the pretty up-to-date version of this software, so we do have some pretty advanced noise editing abilities. So I'm going to go down here and I'm going to take my noise reduction slider and I'm going to go ahead in here and take some of that noise out, because I'm not a big fan of that. And even though I said it's one of the most advanced, the individual adjustment brush doesn't have the most advanced. All I get is this noise reduction slider. What I also see is a little bit of, I don't know if you can see it on your screen, a little bit of magenta, green, blue kind of marks there. That's also a characteristic when you have one of these sensors that isn't the most up-to-date thing. So I have what's called in this tab up here, my noise reduction tab, and also sharpening, but I can actually remove that color noise that I mentioned earlier. So that's a pretty easy thing to do. Let me go back to where I started here. And if you were here with us last week, I did something called a vignette to the image. So I'm going to go back and actually do that. What that does is it makes the corners of the image a little bit darker. It's actually something that, and I was explaining this last week, it's a characteristic of old lenses, and some people say, well, that's not desirable because that puts flaws back in the image. But I honestly think it looks pretty cool, and if you look on a lot of the new imaging sharing services like Instagram, a lot of people make these edits that actually do this. So I think I'm going to do it myself. And we can fool around with a little bit. Midpoint kind of makes the edges, the transition from the light to dark a little bit less. Let's see, but it doesn't seem to be doing much right now. Whoops. Let's go ahead and just keep fooling around with this a little bit. Okay, I like what it's doing here, not so much at the top. So I'm going to take and do this myself with a different tool called the gradient tool. So, and what that does, let me just do it first, and then I can better explain maybe here. Okay, so what this does is it gradually introduces an effect to the image. The strongest part of the effect is going to be on the edge, and it lessens as you move towards the center of the image in this case, because that's the way they're pointed. So all we did there was we had made it a little bit darker, not very much, almost about a half a stop of light. So I want to go ahead and say that might be even too much, because I don't want to darken those clouds, because remember we lightened them earlier. I'm going to do about 0.2 stops, so a very subtle effect. Okay, make it the same on each one. You know what? Sometimes I just got to type it in because it's kind of hard to do that slider. So I really think we're getting somewhere here with this image. I really like it. I think I'm just going to make a couple more adjustments here. I'm going to make that a little bit more vibrant. I also want to make this area down here a little bit more noticeable. So I'm going to increase clarity, which we did in the clouds, makes those corners and the edges of that area a little bit sharper. I am really starting to like that. Let me do a quick check down here, make sure it's not too noisy here. We've introduced a little bit of noise, so I'm going to do what we did in the clouds as well. I'm going to go ahead down to my noise reduction, and we'll go ahead and add some of that just for my taste. Let me show you some. If I really do noise reduction, it's going to make the image a lot softer, which back in earlier versions of these programs is a lot worse. So that actually isn't too bad, but I'm going to dial that back a little bit. Just wanted to show that's the full effect for you so you could see that. Okay. I think I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to bring it into Photoshop, and I'm going to add a quick border just for our presentation purposes. And let's go ahead and add 2 inches around on each side, and I will blow this up reasonably big for you on your screen so you can see it. And that is going to be the final image for us here today. So again, this is in Craters of the Moon National Monument in Idaho. It's on a volcano, and it's actually quite dark and kind of a little bit gloomy up there. So what we've done is accentuated some of the color, bring this a little bit out. There's actually, even though it looks black, the volcano, there's a little bit of color. We emphasize that. And we brought in the blue from that thunderstorm. So I'm pretty pleased with this. I hope you are too. And again, thanks for watching After the Shot. And we're going to have another video here next week. Make sure you subscribe. And Nala here. In fact, I forgot to introduce her. This is Nala the cat. We'll be back with you next week. You guys have a good day. Bye-bye. Are you coming up, sweetie? Are you going to join us? Welcome to the video. Welcome to the video. There we go. All right.